Hey guys, this is Mr. Moore with AP European History, Week 9. And this week we're kind of stepping back from actually learning facts about history or talking about eras. And this week we're going to be focusing on the skills. It turns out that the AP test tests you on your skills and not so much on your historical knowledge. Now, don't get me wrong, you have to know your history. But it's also really just testing you on a set of skills. And so that's what we're going to focus on here. What skills do you need to be successful in an AP history class? And the nice thing about these skills are they'll cross over to other classes. If you were taking, like, say, AP US history next year, or if you took AP World History. But this, of course, is AP European history, and we want to talk about historical perspectives. I like this little visual aid. You've probably seen it before. Kind of depends on what you see. Some people see a duck, some people see a rabbit, some people are like, "Whoa, I didn't even see that before," and some people have seen this, visual aid before. But I think that's really important for all of us to understand that history is not necessarily fact. It's just one version of it. As Napoleon said, or at least supposedly said, history is really just a set of lies that all of us have agreed on, because the winners get to tell the stories. And there's always different point of views. If you've ever seen something happen in real life, and then you've heard about it later on in the news, or you saw, like, say, a fight on campus, and then you heard somebody else talking about it, and you're like, that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. Then you kind of understand how complicated history can be, because it's really about different people's point of views and perspectives. I like to remind my students that if all you ever do is just listen to a lecture, you're not going to learn very much. You're not going to remember very much. So I try to do a variety of things in my class. Yes, I do lecture, because there has to be a point where we kind of learn, and I kind of guide you along, trying to help you become a critical thinker. But I also encourage you to read, right? There's always those weekly assignments, reading from the textbook or the official study guides. There's also audio visual. I do lots of videos in my class to try to help history come alive. I also try to walk you through history and try to help you connect to it, like demonstrating it. I do, under normal circumstances, try to allow time for my students to have discussions with each other. That can still happen in a digital virtual format. I encourage people to work together on assignments. Two minds are always better than one, as long as one's not doing all the work and the other one's just copying it, because that's not learning, right? But one of the things we're doing, of course, is checkpoints after each unit, so you get practice doing things, writing essays, writing thesis, trying to get in that habit of making a claim, working with evidence, and then tying it together with reasoning. But nothing ever teaches you as much as when you are the teacher. I know that sounds weird, but I learned more about history when I started to teach it than I ever did even when I was going to college. So I just try to keep in mind, if you ever have the chance to talk to somebody else and teach them, like you learn something in class and then you talk about it around the dinner table, or you share those thoughts with a friend or a younger brother or sister or whatever, or even if you just, like, mentally pretend like you're teaching it, it's one of the great ways for you to learn things. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the most important things on the AP history test. And so there are really just a couple of important things to pay attention to. First of all, there are 4 parts of the test, and I can't think of anything more important than your ability to score points on the AP test. Okay? There'll be 55 multiple choice questions with 55 minutes to do it in. So there's some skill involved there. Being able to read the questions first and then look at the prompt or the stimulus, the artwork, whatever you're supposed to look at. You'll also be required to do 3 short answer questions. You'll have 40 minutes to do that. they're kind of like one-page answers, or maybe some people think like a couple paragraph answers. When I say short answer, I don't mean one or two sentences. That's never a thing in an AP class. But I'm talking a couple paragraphs maybe. And then, of course, there's two essays. One's a DBQ, document-based question, and the other one is a long essay question. Both of those essays are probably the same writing amount, but one of them, of course, requires you to read documents and use documents, whereas the other one, you pull the information from your mind, from what you've learned in this class. And I'm going to go over each one of those into detail this week in the notes. And of course, I'm going to revisit that multiple times in this class. There are 4 historical time periods, and this is the part where you do need to know the history content. But again, I want to stress that it's not just memorizing facts, okay? There's more than just memorizing facts. So we start this class in 1450, in the middle of the Renaissance, right about the time when the printing press is invented. And we go up to the end of the religious wars in Europe, the end of the 30 Years' War, the Peace of Westphalia, and that's from 1450 to 1648. Within that time period, we're really looking at the Renaissance and exploration and the Reformation, okay? The next chunk of time we're going to talk picks up right after the Peace of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War, which is really the biggest war in European history up to that point. And we go up to the next biggest war, maybe, the Napoleonic Wars. So in the midst of this time frame, we're going to deal with things like the scientific revolution. We're going to be dealing with absolutism and constitutionalism. And we're going to be dealing with some of the biggest revolutions in the history of the world, like the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So we're going to talk about huge political developments that happened in that time frame. This is the end of the Napoleonic era, when Napoleon loses in the Battle of Waterloo and really is exiled to an island in the middle of the Atlantic. It's not the day he dies or the year he dies, but that's the end of his reign of power. Napoleon is one of the most dominant figures during this time period, okay? Then, of course, we're going to pick up the story in this third time period, right after the end of Napoleon, and we kind of get some conservative backlash and people trying to go back to the way things were before the French Revolution. But when we think of the 1800s, we mostly think of the Industrial Revolution. That's the single most, the biggest thing that we want to talk about, the Industrial Revolution. And we'll talk about nationalism and imperialism. And then, of course, this is 1914 is a significant year because that's the beginning of World War I. And then the fourth time period, we'll pick it up from the beginning of World War I up to the present time. So we'll deal with World War I and World War II, the Great Depression that happens in between, and we'll be talking about the Cold War that happens after World War II, and get up into the modern era with the European Union, decolonization, and the war on terrorism even. So that's the content that we're going to cover in this class. You got to know that. You got to know where we're heading. There are 7 themes, thematic concepts that kind of we'll touch on the entire time. So it's not like one of these things is just in one of these time periods, but one of the major things that we're going to deal with the entire year is geography, or Europe's interactions with the rest of the world. We're going to go from Europeans, hanging out just in Europe, not even knowing about North and South America per se, to being the masters of the world and causing world wars, to the point where, of course, they start to lose their overseas empires. In the present, there's a lot of European countries that own territory around the world. So we're going to talk geography the entire class from start to finish, from 1450 to the present. Also, economics is something we're going to have to deal with. Back in this time, we're dealing with trade that was going to Asia, but it was going through middlemen. And then we start to get into what we call mercantilism, where countries are trying to amass precious metals, and they feel like they need to be in a state of constant war because there's a limited amount of resources in the world. And so if you control more of the resources, It's like a finite amount of that. And then we start to move into things like capitalism and consumerism, right? But we also get the opposite in communism. So we'll deal a lot with economics. It's not going to happen in just one of these time periods. It's going to be an ever evolving concept. We're going to talk about culture and intellectual ideas, philosophies that change. We're going to talk about the Enlightenment, and we're going to see artistic trends from Renaissance art to the Baroque era. We're going to get even into like, the classical art music wise, like Beethoven and Bach and Brahms, during the later 1700s and into the 1800s. And we're going to also deal with, like the modern art movement and see how art changes. Art really changes sometime during the 1800s when photography is developed, because artists no longer need to recreate reality. They can start to branch into other things because photos are so much easier to take a photo of someone, where back in the day, if you wanted to get a picture of somebody, they had to paint it, right? I mean, there was no photography before the 1800s per se. Okay. And then we're going to talk about like states and other institutions of power, politics, the development of political parties and republics and constitutionalism and opposition to absolutism. And so we're going to talk about government and politics in this class. We'll talk about social trends and social norms, marriage patterns, what's socially acceptable in the 1800s. If you ever watch any of those movies and you see how proper people used to be, and if you wanted to court somebody, you had to be properly introduced, those kind of things, and to where it is today, where we're very casual in our social interactions. Some of the other things we're going to be dealing with is nations and people. We're going to go from medieval kingdoms all the way up into modern nation states. And we're going to see how France becomes France, and how England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland are going to come together as the United Kingdom. And then there's going to be some opposition where part of Ireland's going to break away into its own republic. And we're going to talk about Spain coming together, and Portugal, and what makes Italy Italy, and what is it to be a Russian? What's that national identity that makes us what we are? And then, of course, throughout this entire class, we're going to be talking about technological advances, where today, you can cross the Atlantic in a few hours in a jet plane, or you can send an email, or like when my brother was stationed in the Air Force over in Germany, we could talk to him via video live, So it's interesting to go from ships. Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, all the way till the present time, where we can go by air travel. So technological advances is going to be a major theme in this class. Okay, so that's really the heart of the social sciences. Now, there are technically 6 skills that you need to be able to prove that you can do. One of the first one is to be able to put the puzzle pieces together. AP Euro calls this development and processes. You can put the pieces of history together and show why it matters. They're not just random facts floating out there in your brain, not just random dates that you can throw out from your brain, but actual putting the pieces of the puzzle together. We also need to teach you sourcing and citation. That is, taking material and properly citing it and knowing where the source comes from. Is the source credible? Can you rely on it? Is it a primary source or a secondary source? Those are some of the skills we're trying to teach you by looking at documents and being able to decipher those. We need you to be able to make a claim and to provide evidence, or if you're given evidence, you can properly use that to back up a claim. If you don't make a claim, then you're not really becoming the type of historian that we want you to. And of course, one of the things we're trying to do is to help you to be able to provide context. That is, set the stage and why things matter, the essential background information that applies to a given situation. Whenever I talk about context, I like to think of like the beginning of a Star Wars movie. If you had a sad childhood and you never saw a Star Wars movie, then I feel pity for you. But for most of us normal people who have seen a Star Wars movie, you know that the first few minutes of a Star Wars movie, there's like a whole bunch of reading that you have to do. Here's this multi-million-dollar action-packed, you know, blockbuster movie, and they make you read for a few minutes. And what they're doing is they're just setting the background. They're saying, here's what's going on in this imaginary world. And that way, when the action starts, you know why these guys are chasing these guys and why we should care about this person that we just met. And so those are some of the things we call context. Okay. The other one is making connections by historical reasoning. And there's really three possibilities when it comes to reasoning. Remember, claim, evidence, reasoning. And when I say reasoning, what I really mean is comparing and contrasting. That's proving reasoning. So if you're going to ever write in this class, it's going to be compare and contrast. Or it might be something like cause and effect, right? If you're going to show cause and effect. Or you might be showing continuity and change over time. So those are the three possible ways that you could do historical reasoning. And of course, the last thing we're trying to do is really to teach you to build an argument. And those are the skills in this AP European history class. Okay, so now that we've talked about these skills, we understand them, I think it's good for us to pause sometimes. And I guess that's one of the things that maybe I should remind you in class. I have the ability as the teacher to kind of pause things and kind of take a break. And I kind of get a feel for where students are at. And there's sometimes, this interaction that happens between teacher and student. Because I'm recording this ahead of time, I just want to remind you that you can pause. You can pause the button. You can think about these things. If you get into a lulled state and all you're doing is being a spectator and a bored spectator, and you're not thinking critically about the things that we're talking about, you might struggle. You might not really go as deep as you could or should. So what I did just a second ago is I went over these four things, and what I'm going to do the rest of the notes is just break down these four things and just go a little bit deeper into each one of them, okay? So the multiple choice questions take up 40% of the test score. Okay, under normal circumstances, there will be 55 multiple choice questions in 55 minutes. And they're all in an AP style, meaning that they'll force you to read something or look at an artwork or a painting or a chart or a graph, and then to answer a set of questions based on the stimulus that you look at. And so how you might want to effectively approach these, you might look at the set of questions, and then you might look at the materials and see what's provided. You might even want to skip the questions that you can't answer and then go back to them if you have time. So it turns out that maybe time management might be more as important or maybe even more important than how much you know. Unfortunately, I've seen some students where they spend so much time on these questions that they don't understand and they had to guess anyways. And then they didn't even finish the multiple choice section and they could have answered the last set of questions. You know, the last 5 or 10 questions they could have done really well on, but they spent all of their time trying to get through ones that they didn't know the information about anyways. So it turns out that test taking skills might be just as important as how much content knowledge you understand. Okay. Remember that all these AP questions, you have to peel back the layers. And I try to do that in class sometimes. Like when we were talking about the Reformation, I showed a map and I was kind of talking about Protestants. And yet there was no word Protestant anywhere on the map. But you had to know that Lutherans or Calvinists, okay, or even Anglicans, those are Protestants. So even though the word didn't, the map didn't say Protestant anywhere, if I ask you where were the Protestant parts of Europe, see, you have to be able to peel back the layers. And it's not just, if I said, where are the Lutherans? And it said Lutherans and it had a color and you just had to point to it, that's really shallow. And these AP style questions are going to force you to peel back layers and help you to really understand what you're asking. I've put some links to some sample AP European multiple choice questions with an answer key. So you can click on those links and see actual sample AP style multiple choice questions along with the correct answers that can kind of help you be a guide. The second part of the test, of course, as we mentioned before, is the short answer questions. There, it makes up 20% of the test score. You have to do 3 questions in 40 minutes. So that's, if you just simple mathematics would tell you that's like 13 minutes per question, something like that, right? You take 40 and divide it by 3, you're talking 12, 13 minutes-ish. So actually, what there's going to be is 4 questions. You're required to do question number 1 and number 2, but you get to choose between 3 and 4. And right there, what I just said is one of the simplest and most basic things. I've had some students try to do all 4, and I said, why? They're not going to grade all 4. They're just going to grade 3. So you're wasting your time. So just simple things like hearing me and understanding what you're supposed to do. They'll give you 4 questions. You're required to do question number 1 and question number 2, but then you're going to choose between 3 and 4, obviously choosing the one you know more about. Each of the 3 questions will each have 3 parts. So question 1 will have 3 parts, and question 2 will have 3 parts, and question 4, 1 and 2 will all have 3. So all of them will have 3 parts. Don't know how much more clear I could be than that. So each question is worth 3 points, and it's really straightforward. You just answer the question, providing some specific details. There's no rubric. You just have to answer all 3 parts. One of the things that I'll teach you as we get a little bit later into the class, I'll try to help you manage your time. And so let's say you're looking at question 1 and you don't know anything about question 1, then I'll say skip it and go straight to number 2. And then if you don't know anything about number 2, then skip that one and choose between 3 and 4, and then go back to question 1 and 2 with the time you have. But you're gonna spend the most of your time on the one you know the most about, just to make sure that you score the most points possible. Unfortunately, some students will end up spending more time on the ones they don't know, and that's the worst possible choice you can make. They try to BS their way through an answer, and I'm like, well, if you're going to have to BS your way through an answer, then leave that to the end. Go take care of the ones you know a lot about and spend way extra time on those ones so you make sure you score some points, and then go back to the ones you're going to have to fake your way through. So it really does turn into time management. Again, I've given you a link here at the bottom of the page to a sample SAQ, and I have some sample SAQs with, answer keys and stuff like that too that I can show in class. The LEQ is going to be the last part of the test. The LEQ is worth 15% of the test score, and you need to answer 1 question in a 5-paragraph essay in 40 minutes. So how do you effectively take on the LEQ? You need to pick 1 out of 3 questions. So they're actually going to give you 3 different options on the LEQ, and you pick the one that you know the most about. If you try to answer all 3, you won't score any points. So again, it's one of those things where skills and just paying a basic attention and just listening, will help you tremendously. So there'll be 3 options. You're going to pick the one you know the most about, and it's very much like a DBQ. The difference is there's no documents to use. So all the evidence has to come from your head. The thesis or claim and the contextualization in the first paragraph is the exact same thing you would do in a DBQ. And actually the body essays, the body paragraphs of your essay are going to be very much like a DBQ, but there's nothing to cite and there's no documents to use. So you got to come up with the evidence from your head, but you're still going to describe it and you're still going to support your argument. Okay. And as you've studied the how to do a DBQ, you know that you're supposed to hippo documents. Now, if there's no documents to Hippo, obviously you can't do that. So you're just going to stick to that reasoning. And of course, the reasoning is either causation or comparison or continuity and change over time. And just like the DBQ, the last point is proving complex understanding of a topic. So I generally teach people how to do a DBQ first, because that's the real monster to try to tackle. But once you get the DBQ down, I think the LEQ will flow really good for you. Sometimes people call this the FRQ part of the test. That is the free response question part. It's the writing component, and lots of people like it because it's not like a right or wrong answer. There's so many different options for you to score the points that most people really like the writing part, because they can kind of focus on what they know and they don't have to focus on what they don't know, which should kind of be a duh. Multiple choice questions are either right or wrong, but writing, there's so many different directions a person could go. I gave you a sample LEQ question right here, a link to it that was given to us as teachers by the College Board. So you're welcome to click on that and take a look at an actual AP Euro LEQ question. Now, the DBQ is usually people consider the most challenging part of the test. Actually, last year, for the students who took the AP test last year because of COVID-19, in 2019, or actually it was the 2020 test, but the beginning of the year was 2019. Anyways, the 2020 test, they dropped everything else except the DBQ. So I have no idea what they're going to do this year. I imagine it's going to be a full test, but we don't know what's going to happen here because things are happening, changing so much. But that's the one thing they did not drop was the DBQ. So either way, it's 25% of the test score, and you're going to answer one question in a 5-paragraph essay, and you have 60 minutes to do it, which means you have 15 minutes to prep, and then you take the rest of the time to answer the question. I try to encourage my students to leave a few minutes at the end of both their LEQ and their DBQ to proofread. But when I say proofread, I don't actually mean grammar or spelling. I mean scoring points. And you'll notice that these points are almost exactly like the LEQ points. So both of these essays are very similar. The obvious difference is in the DBQ, you have to use the documents you're given as your evidence to prove your point. So in the first paragraph, you would make a claim, which means you answer the question. You answer the question. You make it obvious what statement you're making. And you're not summarizing and you're not rephrasing the question, but you're answering it. And then, of course, you've got to provide some essential background information. Which order you do those two in doesn't really matter, but that's what you're doing in the first paragraph. You're not using the documents. Where you use the documents is in the body of the essay. However many paragraphs, traditionally it's 3, body paragraphs, but it doesn't matter. It could be 4, it could be 2 giant ones, but you're going to use all of the documents, okay? You're going to describe a document, and when you're done describing it, you're going to shift directions, but still use the same document to show how it supports your argument. So you're going to combine those two things. The describe and the support are going to blend together, one document at a time. Never, ever, ever using the documents in the order they're given. You're going to group the documents to make an argument. The reason we can't use them in order is because then you're not making an argument. You're just putting the documents in your own words, and that's not the point. You're putting the documents in your own words to prove a point. Okay? Anyways, point number 3 and 4 definitely go together. And of course, the 5th point is the Hippo. That is showing the historical situation of the document, or the intended audience of the document, or the purpose of the author. What was he trying to do with this document? What was the point of it? And then, of course, the last P is point of view or perspective. The O stands for and reminds us to organize the documents to form an argument. In the final paragraph is when you need to bring in outside evidence. The LEQ is all outside evidence, right? That's all you do in the LEQ. So in the DBQ, you just have to bring in one piece of outside evidence. In the LEQ, you've got to bring in 2 or 3. I would recommend 3, but if you can only pull 2 out of your head, that will probably be sufficient as long as it's detailed and specific. But in the DBQ, you just got to pull one thing out of your own head. And then, of course, you are trying to prove complex understanding and tie it together with reasoning. Everything we do in this class, writing-wise, you've got to make a claim, you've got to provide evidence or work with evidence, and you've got to tie it together with those historical reasoning. And I've given you a sample DBQ with docs. Okay. I got some visual aids trying to remind you. I've actually heard some people joke that the letters AP, which of course stands for Advanced Placement, but some people joke that AP stands for Answer the Prompt, because lots of people get writing an essay and they forget that simple gig to answer the question. That's the whole point of the DBQ. Okay, if you could just stick to the rubric, that would be great. Okay, the rubric. I just said HIPPO, and I kind of went over it, so I'll kind of brush over this for a second. But remember, HIPPO is just an acronym to remind you to, if you could tie in the historical situation, you look at the dates and you think about what you learned in class that was happening at that time, and how does it affect the writing, and what's being written, or the artwork, or whatever it is you're looking at. How does the time frame of an event can help you infer what's going on beyond what the text actually says. So you're showing you have some depth. And remember, you only have to HIPPO half of the documents. The I, of course, is the intended audience. Like, who's the source? Who is it written by, or who is it written to, or knowing who wrote it or why it was written. Okay, the intended audience. And of course, the first P is the purpose of the author. Like, what's their agenda? What's their point? What point are they trying to make? What's the underlying cause? What side are they on? What's the message of the doc, and why did they write it? What's it really saying? The other P stands for point of view or perspective. Who you are can affect how you see an event, and this can change the bias of the document. Okay, a document written at the same time from a man as opposed to a woman is going to have a different perspective. A Catholic and a Protestant, or a Christian and a Muslim, okay? Or a king or a peasant. You get the idea. There's just lots of different ways we could tackle this. You don't have to use all of these letters, but you're going to use one of these letters for at least 3 of the documents. So if it's easy for you to do the P, then do that on 3 different documents. Awesome. Or if one of them, it's obvious how to use the H, and another one, it's obvious how to do the purpose of the author. I mean, it kind of depends on what the documents are and your ability to understand them. So you get a lot of leverage on how to use the HIPPOs. But of course, the last one is grouping them together so that you're answering the prompt, right? You're kind of showing how, where, and why, how to use your documents. That's why I tell students never use them in order. Otherwise, you're going to just be summarizing them, and you don't get any points for summarizing the documents, okay? It's all about answering the question. Remember, DBQ stands for document-based questions. When it comes to sources, we're trying to help students see what history really is, and I try to tell my students I didn't fall in love with history sitting at a desk. I fell in love with history when I was walking the streets of Jerusalem with my own sandals and swimming in the Dead Sea, or when I spent several days on a small little felucca, a little sailboat going down the Nile River, and got to walk around the Great Pyramids at Giza with my own eyes, see them with my own eyes, touch them with my own hands. When I got to walk the streets of Rome, or I got to swim in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Spain, or when I got to walk through on a little ferry trail in Ireland and kind of read some of the old stories of the Irish myths, or when I got to walk the streets of Sydney, Australia, and read some of the plaques that they have on where some of the convicts were being dumped in a penal colony because they were trying to empty the prisons of Great Britain. I tell you again, I didn't fall in love with history reading a textbook. You've got to get out and you've got to see it for yourself. And you've got to make the story come alive for yourself. And that's what I try to do for my students, but you've got to bring something to the table as well. So one of the things that if we were in class, this is kind of a fun exercise to do, but I ask sometimes students this picture right here. What do you see going on? What do you notice going on? Can you tell what's happening here? What famous event is being portrayed? And sometimes students are like, no, it's just a painting. How are we supposed to know, Mr. Moore? And I say, exactly. So don't ever do this in the test. Don't ever just look at the artwork. Look at the words around the artwork, because if they ever put a painting or a picture or even some text, they're going to put people's names, they're going to put dates to try to help you understand what it is. So if I put just a date, 1618, does this ring a bell in your head? Does that help you? You're like, oh, okay, now I know what it is. Some of you still might be like lost, like, well, I don't know. Okay. If you know when the first time period ends in 1648, then 1618 is 30 years earlier. Maybe that's starting to ring a bell. If I tell you where, some people are like, oh, okay, the Holy Roman Empire. This is in Germany. Okay. Yeah, I know what's going on right here. If I tell you that this revolves around the 30 Years' War, some of you might say, oh, this is the defenestration of Prague. This is what started the 30 Years' War. This is when some Protestants threw some Catholics out of a window. Okay, that's literally what the word defenestration means. Could you categorize this historical theme? Remember that there was 7 themes. Do you remember that? There were 7 themes. Okay. What are those 7 themes? Well, Europe's interactions with the world, states and other institutions of power, economics, society and culture, national identity, technology, right? So as you look at a document, I think you should try to categorize it into one of those 7 themes. That will help you to develop an argument. This is obviously culture, right? Courting practices, right? If you can read it right there, courtship. You couldn't, if you saw a lady that you liked, you couldn't just go up and ask her out on a date. You had to be properly introduced. And quite frankly, a lot of history, people haven't been able to choose who they marry. Most societies have had arranged marriages where the parents hook the kids up, in suitable situations, okay? How would you categorize this? Is this economics? Is this geography? Is this politics? Is this science and technology? Okay. So being able to look at something and being able to use some critical thinking skills will help you as you start to develop these skills. Okay. Remember, it all comes down to claim, evidence, and you tie it together with your logical connections. And one of the toughest points for students to score, both on the LEQ and the DBQ, is the complex understanding point. And that's putting all of the pieces together, understanding the historical developments and connecting the content. For example, this class starts in 1450. In 1453, it's called the Fall of Constantinople, as Turkish Muslim armies destroy the walls of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire falls. How does that lead to the founding of modern day Mexico? And if you're like, there's no connection, Mr. Moore, this is taking place in the modern country of Turkey, in the Mediterranean Sea, where Europe, Africa, and Asia come together. What does that have to do with Mexico? Well, somebody who really understands the pieces of the puzzle knows that when the Turks cut off trade with Asia in 1450 with the fall of Constantinople, European merchants tried to look for different routes to Asian markets. That's what motivated Columbus to go sailing. He was trying to make it to Asian markets. That's what motivated Bartholomew Diaz and even later Vasco da Gama, right? They were trying to find Asian access to Asian markets. But instead, they ended up in the New World, right? Spanish explorers ended up in the New World, and they ended up conquering the old Aztec Empire. And if you look on the flag of Mexico today, it's got that Aztec symbol. And so if you start putting the pieces of the puzzle together, that's what I mean when I say complex understanding. Okay? One thing that's really fascinating, that's kind of a deeper thought, is called historiography. It's studying the history of how we look at history, because how we view history has changed over time. That's kind of a deep thought. It's like one of those things like thinking about thinking, like you can start to get yourself into a really, philosophical conundrum. But how we view the past is different. When I learned history, in grade school and in high school, is different than how we're teaching it today. Instead of just teaching a narrative, now we're teaching more skills, and we're saying, you know what? Nobody's ever going to know all the facts about history, but you've got to have a set of skills that you can use to really put the pieces of the puzzle together. And that way, when you learn new information, you can piece it together. Historical reasoning, as we said, is really one of three things. So you'll use all three of these throughout the AP test. But like if you're writing an essay, it's not going to include all three of these. It's going to be one of these. So it's either going to be a compare and a contrast essay showing similarities and differences, or your essay is going to be a causation, understanding why things happen, how events build on each other, and the ability to put events in order, right? Cause and effect. Or it's going to be continuity and change, right? Seeing trends over time along with general similarities and differences across countries and cultures. So again, those are the three reasoning processes. Whenever you write in an AP class or any kind of social science class, you've got to kind of think that your writing is on trial. Okay, so you have to imagine that your DBQ or your LEQ is on trial, just like it's in a court case. And so you're the prosecutor and you have the burden of proof. If you don't make a good case or you don't present your evidence with a strong argument, you lose. Okay? And your essay will go to jail or it's going to fail, right? Think of any good cop show you've seen. The police can't arrest a person if they don't have credible evidence. Even if they know the person is guilty, the suspect walks if the cops don't have solid evidence. Same thing with your essay. You might be right, and your thesis might be right, but if you don't have strong evidence to back it up, you're not going to win your case. At the trial, each lawyer makes a claim, and usually the opposite direction. And that's the nice thing. Some people love this about the social sciences, and some people hate it. Some people love math because 1 + 1 is always going to equal 2. Always. But in the social science, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer. It all depends on how you use the evidence. At the trial, each lawyer makes a claim. Then each lawyer presents their evidence, their side of the story. The one who presents the better argument wins the case. This might sound harsh, but it doesn't matter if the person's innocent or guilty. It matters how good the lawyer is, and it matters what evidence they present. And that's your job on this class. It doesn't matter if you give the right or wrong answer. It matters how you justify it. If your argument is not sound, or if you don't have solid evidence, your case or your essay falls apart when it is cross-examined, right? When somebody reads your essay and they're like, it's not a very strong argument, you start to lose, okay? Think of the teacher as the defense lawyer. They will take apart your argument if your claim is not backed up by proof and reasoning. No one cares what you say unless you can back it up with facts, okay? It doesn't matter what you know, it matters what you can prove. Okay. So at the very beginning, we said that you need to know how to score points. The second thing is we said that you have to know the content time periods. So I'm going to spend every week asking you to read from the textbook or the official study guides or listening to my lectures when I lecture on topics. In fact, all the other weeks in this class, I'm going to focus on the actual historical content and try to teach you the skills by having you practice those skills. So this is really the only week where I really focus on the skillage. Most of the time I'm teaching the content. So you can know the places, the ideas, the eras, you can take things and put it in the right era. Okay. Do you know why things happened? You always have to ask that question in a history class. Why? Don't ever just accept that it happened. You have to ask why and know why it matters and how it connects to other things. Okay. So I'm not going to spend tons of time on this because I'm going to spend every week doing this. But obviously, in time period one, from 1450 to 1648, we have learned about the Renaissance and exploration, and we have focused on the Age of Reformation. Those are the three main concepts that we talk about in time period one. In time period two, from 1648 to 1815, we focus on absolutism and constitutionalism, and we focus on the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Okay, we will also talk about revolutions like the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution. I mean, there's a lot more than just those ones, but those are the big ones that we focus on. When we get into the third period, we'll also talk about Latin American independence, the revolutions of 1848, that is. But the revolutions we talk about here are going to be the American and French revolutions. From 1815 to 1914, one of the big things in the 1800s is the Industrial Revolution. That has changed our lives more than any other topic that we will talk about. We'll also focus on nationalism and imperialism, and in simple terminology, that is patriotism and taking over the world as Europeans do. In the last time period, we're going to focus on the world wars, both World War I, the Great War, and World War II, an even bigger war, and of course the Cold War. And where we're going to get into like contemporary Europe and globalization. Those are the 9 units. And at the end of each unit, I will give you the official AP Euro progress check so that you can see how you're doing. And when I score that for you, I hope that you take it seriously and do your best so we can see where you're at. I'm not going to repeat these because I have before, but these are the 7 themes that we have covered in this class and that we will cover in this class. During all 4 time periods, we're going to be using these 7 themes. Economics, geography, culture, and philosophical, developments, government and politics. Okay, national identity and technology, right? We talked about all of those before. Again, I have mentioned the 6 skills, and if you want to go click on this link down here at the bottom, it will take you to the official AP Euro College Board website where it goes over the skills that are assessed when you take the AP class. And really what we're trying to do is get you to connect to the content. Okay, a student has to make an emotional connection to the content, the facts, or they just won't truly understand the principles and concepts being taught. If you don't make an emotional connection to the content, then it's boring. History is not boring. Hollywood spends millions, I would say billions of dollars recreating history because it sells. People love it. It's action-packed. But you've got to get an emotional connection to it. Okay? Like understanding that there are about 7 billion people on the planet Earth right now. If I throw out the number 7 billion, at first you might say, 7 billion, okay, we get it, Mr. Moore, I already knew that. You're not teaching me anything new. Do you know how big of a number 7 billion is? It's incomprehensible to the human mind. You can't even conceive of the number 7 billion. It's impossible for your brain to comprehend 7 billion. And you might say, no, it's not, Mr. Moore. I just said 7 million. See, it's not that hard. But it's impossible to count to 7 billion. If you spent your entire life counting from the second you were born, which is not possible, and you counted, you didn't eat, you didn't sleep, all you did was count, and you lived to be 100, and I'm sorry, most of us won't make it that far, you wouldn't even make it halfway to 7 billion. If all you did was count your entire life, that's how big a number 7 billion is. So if we start to take some of these numbers and we try to put an emotional connection to it, it becomes so much more fascinating and interesting. Okay? For instance, World War II, Americans lost somewhere over 400,000 soldiers in World War II. But World War II wasn't fought on American soil at all. The only thing that's even remotely close to a battle being fought on American soil was Pearl Harbor. But that wasn't even a state. If you talk to Native Hawaiians, they don't feel like that's American soil. So it was an official territory, so I understand that. But there was no battles of World War II fought, okay, on the continental United States. Yeah, maybe some of the Alaskan islands with some Japanese trying to get a foothold, okay? And yes, Pearl Harbor. But if we're going to talk about Pearl Harbor, we should probably talk about the Philippines because that was a territory of the U.S. at the same time. But the Soviet Union lost over 20 million people. Over 20 million souls in the Soviet Union were lost because epic battles took place and horrific atrocities were committed during World War II. And so it's definitely more emotional for the Soviets during World War II. Americans get hyped up about World War II because we won with little consequences. The Soviets beat the Nazis, broke the back of the Nazi war machine at the Battle of Stalingrad, the biggest battle in the history of humankind. More people died in Stalingrad than any other battle in the history of the world. So there's a different emotional connection, and that's what we're trying to do is help you connect to the content. There is a disconnect to the information unless we can fit the facts into something that we can connect to. And that's what I try to do. I have some embedded videos. I have some samples of historical reasoning, like cause and effect, what causes an event to happen and what effects flow from it. Okay. And what we do today will affect our tomorrow. We try to help students to see that. We try to help them analyze historic evidence using primary and secondary sources to provide context and validity, backing up your ideas with facts and proving your point, and developing an argument, understanding the justification for historical events and differing point of views, using logic and reason backed by facts. History is like dominoes, and I'm not talking about the pizza. I'm talking about the game as one thing always leads to another. And that's really that process and development, If you want to know why one thing happened, you always have to take one step back and ask the question, why? 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 And putting those puzzle pieces together. Some teachers call it synthesis. But I'm going to refer to it always as complex understanding. Okay? Remember, primary sources means that somebody was actually there, or an object, like a physical document, was actually written during the time that we're studying. These sources were present. They saw it themselves, right? They might have different point of views, okay, but they actually were there, like relics, journals, letters, speeches, photos, paintings. A secondary source, it tries to interpret what happened in the past or analyzes a primary source. So some of these sources are a step removed from the actual event. They weren't actually there. I was never at the Battle of Waterloo, so I can never be a primary source for the Battle of Waterloo, okay? But maybe I could be a source for 9/11 because I saw it on TV. What if I was actually there? Okay, I wasn't actually in the World Trade Center. So am I a primary source or a secondary source? Well, I'm probably a secondary source because I saw it on TV, but I was getting it through news reports. So I wasn't actually there. Okay, so you got to be careful about what's a real primary source versus a secondary source. Um, okay, like textbooks, internet websites, they might have some actual primary sources on them or in them, but they themselves are commentary on the past, documentaries and films and such. Again, I've got some great videos that are embedded. There are different ways to look at history. Some people are social historians where they look at the day-to-day lives, what home life was like, what marriage and relationships were like, what was the culture like. Then there's political history that looks at like wars and conflict and who was reigning, who was the presidents of the United States or who was the kings of England, or, that's definitely a political history. And each country tells their own story. And we always try to make ourselves look like the good guys, right? Isn't that interesting? Even though maybe we did some horrible things, we always try to tell it from the good guy story. Or there's topical history. Like there's some people who just focus on art history. In college, I took an art history class. Or you might take a military history class in college. Definitely you can focus on, like, say, the history of medicine, or even like the history of filmmaking. So there's different ways to analyze history and to break it down. Most of us, or most of what we know about the past, is educated guesswork that historians piece together from what they find, relics and artifacts. And so we don't really know what happened in the past. But if we find enough evidence that points in the same direction, then we can generalize, okay? History changes over time. Remember that idea of historiography? That history changes over time as we discover new things. And so in the future, people might look back and say, historians back in 2020 were getting it wrong because they didn't have these pieces of the puzzle. And so, like, we see history different now than they did 200 years ago, even though 200 years ago, they could have been studying ancient Babylon, which was thousands of years before. Okay. But now we have more evidence, more archaeology. And of course, if we get before 4000 BC, it gets really, really guesswork, because all we have is artifacts and we're trying to piece it together without any kind of written language. Remember, writing is invented, and it depends. If you go Google it, it's going to say something like, 3,200 or 3,500. Yeah, there's different, takes on it. And again, maybe there's new evidence that shows it was even earlier. But if you get much before 4000 BC, it's all guesswork anyways. Historians know little about the world's culture before writing was invented. Okay? To study history, we have to ask questions. If you don't ask questions, you won't really learn. Okay? If you don't have questions, then you won't get answers. If you want to know why things are happening today, you must look at the past to find those answers. But your answers might depend on whose point of view you're getting. Why did it happen? That's the question you have to keep asking. If we do not learn from the past, then we are doomed to repeat it. Keep in mind the important who and what, where, when, why, and how. Those are the questions that force us to ask. 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 Okay? What is history? It's the study of who we are and what makes us as a group of people who we are. Lots of times people get interested in history when they start studying their own family's past. Do you know where your ancestors came from? Because I think that some Americans think they're actual Americans. But let's be honest, if you're white, your ancestors came from Europe. And if you're black, your ancestors came from Africa. And if you're somewhere in between, then we can start to trace the roots of where that came from. Some people know their origin, and they even call themselves, I am Arab American, I'm Irish American, I'm Mexican American, right? I'm a Latino, I'm a Latin American. So people like to categorize But the more you know about your family's past, you might get more interested in history, just discovering where your family comes from. We can learn lessons from history so that we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. And we learn about history through records that people leave behind, our ancestors. So it really is the story of all of us. History is a big part of where we live and in our state and our nation. There's just history is swallowing around us. Okay. History is the study of who we are and the things that make us as a group of people who we are. Okay. And helps us to not make the same mistakes over and over again. Um, these are just some test taking steps to eat a good breakfast, get good sleep, make sure you've studied and you don't cram the night before, um, because ultimately this entire class boils down to an AP test. And as we ask these questions about society in general, we could ask those questions about ourselves. Again, the more connections we make to ourselves, and we see history in entertainment, we see history in our own religious beliefs, we see history in where we live. Like there's a history to the town of Apple Valley, right? Roy Rogers, Dell Evans. Have you heard of those people? Right? Even jobs, like the history of a workplace. Apple Valley High School has history. It's been around since the 1970s. And how did we get our mascot? And who was our first principal, right? So it's all around us. History engulfs us. And that's kind of where I want to leave today on week number 9. There's always some great review videos. And this week I put in some videos that I've posted in other places, but how to write a good DBQ and LEQ and how to write a good thesis. And of course, a little bit of history content that where we're at. Thanks for being with me, guys. I hope you learned a lot. Take care.